Turn this off. Turn this on. There we go. When I was in the army, I encountered these people called career managers. I'm sure it's the same in any large organisation, particularly government. And these people, and they would rotate people into career management positions, and they were just, normal officers and soldiers who moved out of their normal job and worked as a career manager. Then they'd go back into their normal job. Okay, it was just a rotating system. Anyway, the career manager was there to advise you on your promotion prospects and postings, so where you might go next, and to give you some advice on your career. Now, that's all good. Sometimes going to see your career manager, which happened every year, was a bit of a reality check if you had unrealistic expectations about, being promoted. And sometimes it was a real encouragement. They might say something to you you didn't expect. Or at other times it was just, business as normal. During my last couple of years in the army, I was keen to finish well and have my last posting, my last position, for me to fulfil the 2-year requirement. Normally you get a job for 2 years or maybe 3, and then you move on to something else. So I was keen to finish well and do my last job, which was at Bandiana down in Wodonga, managing the chaplain team down there, right? And I was looking forward to it, and I wanted to do it for 2 years. But my 60th birthday was looming, and it was only a year away. So it looked like I was only going to do 1 year in that job and then have to retire because compulsory retirement was at 60. And so I said this to the career manager, look, I'd really like to do 2 and get an extension to work until 61 and finish, like that. And he said, oh, no worries, Greg, that's good, that's fine, that's what we like to see. And it'll be good for you, good for the army, good for the position down there to do 2 years. Hey, look, mate, don't worry about it. I'll even put it in writing. So he sent me an email confirming it, right, the arrangement. Can you get an indication of what's coming next? Then when the day came for the career manager to talk to me, when that year was coming along, I said, oh yeah, how's it going? 2 years, that's what you promised? He says, oh look, Greg, things have changed. You're coming towards 60 and it looks like that's all it's going to be. And that's all it was. And, I felt like ringing him and saying, mate, you promised, how about you don't lie, tell lies and keep your promise for a change, you career managers. But I knew it was useless because in the army you often get told the little term service needs, right? The service, army, their needs. So just a phrase, service needs, trumps every other promise that's made. And of course, when recruits go to Kapooka, they often get told by recruiting to get them in, look, these are the jobs going now, but you've got your heart set on this other job. Hey, just take the job that we're telling you to take at the moment because of service needs. Once you get through Kapooka, no trouble. You'll be able to transfer and do the job you really want. Guess what? In most cases, that doesn't happen. They finish their 3 months, they say, oh great, oh, how's that transfer to this other job going? Oh, sorry, service needs have changed. It looks like you're stuck with the first job. And when you do try to put up a bit of a protest, they just say, well, mate, you've got to be flexible in the army. Things change. In the end, it all worked out well. And I was glad I only worked 1 year and retired at 60 because the Lord had other plans for us, obviously. And I was glad about it in the end. But I think, we've all been stung by broken promises, haven't we? And we've all made promises that maybe we've had to change or break. I think we can all say over time that's happened. It's a big issue when you think about it. This thing about making vows, making promises that Jesus is talking about here is a big issue that does impact us over our life. And you might say, look at a house deposit when you're purchasing a house. Let's say it's a 10% deposit. I know those deposit amounts change, but let's say 10% deposit. What really is it? It's an oath. It's saying, you say you want to buy my property, and you've signed this bit of paper saying you want to buy it, but I want more than just your word. I want something stronger than just your word to back up that you're going to keep this promise. It's like an oath. So you pay 10%, and if you renege on that promise during that period, you lose your money. Like, it's a pretty big incentive to keep your promise, isn't it? The 10% deposit. So all that is designed to reinforce making promises. Don't make rash promises. Don't say you're going to do something with the mind to pull out. Human cultures developed oaths because people could not trust their neighbour's words without calling on an avenging deity. Okay, so oaths and making oaths, the ultimate way to make an oath was to swear on their deity. Like, obviously the Israelites would ask the Lord to witness to their promise. But it wasn't just, in the Bible, in Israelite culture, Hebrews. It was in all cultures. They often did this. They would call upon whatever deity they worshipped to witness to their promise. Like to say, I'm not just saying idle words here, because I call on the god Odin to bring me to account if I go back on this promise. And there was often a punishment, if you did not fulfill your words. And that was the whole idea of it. To break an oath was a dangerous thing to do, since the avenging deity would repay your deceitfulness. Okay? So the whole thing was designed to reinforce promise making and making oaths. Today's courts still require oaths at the commencement of testimony. We've all seen it on TV, or maybe you've had to do it yourself. Swear on the Bible that what you're going to say is true. In other words, you say you're going to say some words, but I want to make sure those words, you've really thought about them and you're really going to keep them. So swear on the Bible or whatever. You don't have to do it on the Bible these days. And if you don't keep your word, or if you say something that is not true, there's the added inducement of the punishment of perjury in courts, isn't there? It's all designed to help people speak the truth and not speak deceitfully. In this passage, Jesus addresses common abuses of making oaths and challenges us to be promise keepers. That's what we're looking at today. Jesus said in chapter 5, verse 33, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oaths, but keep the oaths you've made to the Lord.'" So the first thing we need to think about here is what was in the head of the people that Jesus was talking to. What was their, teaching before this about oaths? Why was it an important thing? Why was it a serious thing? What was the problems associated with it? The first thing we need to understand is the whole idea of oaths is all about assurance. It's about, we sort of do it even in normal language. You may not even realise it. Like, say you say to someone, let's have a holiday in, Cairns. And you just say that quickly. And someone says, really? Yeah, I promise. We'll have a holiday in Cairns. I know last time I had to change my mind, but I promise you this time we'll have a holiday. I mean, what's happening there is you're saying a word, but the person's wanting a little bit more assurance that what you're saying you're really going to do and you've really thought about it. It's like an oath. It's the same deal. So let's get into the heads of the people who were listening to Jesus. So what was the teaching about oaths? Well, the first thing that's important here is Exodus 20 verse 7. It says, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. For the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name." So this explained the seriousness of using the Lord's name for the wrong purpose. Okay, so then the next one, which is sort of adds to that a little bit more, you can think of Leviticus 19 verse 12. "Do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." So if a person makes an oath and calls God as their witness, that they are going to tell the truth and they're going to act on what they say, if they break that promise, it will make God out to be untrustworthy. It'll make the Lord look bad. Okay, so don't use the Lord's name falsely when you swear, not swearing as in, say, a swear word, but when you promise to do something and call God as your witness. If you don't, you're profaning the name of the Lord. Does that make sense? And then Numbers chapter 30 verses 1 and 2. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said." Right? So it's just development. In other words, keep your promises, people. Keep what you say. I think we all appreciate that, don't we? Like, I wasn't impressed when my career manager went back on his word. I mean, worked out well, and in the end I calmed down. But what if you were someone else who really was hoping on that? What if, which is what often happened, people wanted postings back to where their family lived? Because in the army, people get transferred a lot. So often the family or, the spouse would say, "I'm not moving from Brisbane anymore." And so they'd settle there and they'd say, "Okay, you want to keep going around the place, going to Townsville, going to Adelaide, going to Puckapunyal, whatever. That's fine, but we're staying put. Our kids are at school." And so the soldier, man or woman, would often go away for a couple of years, and then he'd be really sweating on getting his next posting back to where his family was. Of course, that's what he'd ask. And so the career manager would say, "Yeah, no worries, mate, you can go back to Brisbane." All in writing. Then it comes. "Sorry, service needs. You're going to Sydney, to Holsworthy." Sometimes these things can have devastating effects on family, as you could imagine. Not just an idle word, but people keeping their promises or not keeping their oath can be very, very serious and have big effects. So we can understand why the Old Testament is saying here, why it's really important. And then in Numbers 30, we see these rules starting to be applied in more specific areas, right? So Numbers 30 deals with when a young girl or a newly married girl or a girl who's still at home, and in those days, the female was very much under the authority of the father and then the husband, right? That's the way things work. So it deals with if a young woman or a wife makes a rash promise, right, or a vow, she says, "Oh, I'm going to do this." And then her father hears about it. If he does nothing about it and goes, and just doesn't mention it to her, then she can keep that vow, that promise. But if he says something and says, I don't want you to do that, darling, then that vow or promise is overridden by his, authority over her. And she doesn't have to keep that vow or rash promise, as it's sometimes mentioned. And it's the same with, a married woman. If she makes a rash promise or a vow to do something, a husband has the right and to veto that. And if he doesn't say anything in the first instance and lets it go, well, she can do it. It's sort of fair, isn't it? I think that makes a lot of sense. So we've looked at, don't use the Lord's name in vain, don't use it wrongly, don't swear falsely by my name. Keep your vows, and there's exceptions when those vows and promises can be overridden. Of course, then there's sort of less formal oaths, and you could say that these are like, I guess, solemn promises or maybe just a promise. And you see one example in 2 Kings chapter 2. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha, the two prophets, were on their way to Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel." And then he says, but Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." Okay? So here, you wouldn't call that a vow because it's not really officially done, in the temple. But it's a promise that calls upon God. It says, "As surely as the Lord lives." Like God is, the truth that God is alive and He exists, I'm calling on that truth to back up my word that I'm never going to leave you. Right? He could have just said, like Jesus said, "Let your yes be yes. I won't leave you." But He doesn't. He calls upon God as His witness to say, what I'm saying to you, I'm really, really, really going to do. I'm never going to leave you. Right? So here's some stuff teaching that the Israelites would have heard, would have understood, and would have thought when Jesus said this in the Sermon on the Mount. So the Mosaic law forbade making irreverent oaths, light use of the Lord's name, and breaking vows. Then interestingly, we come to Ecclesiastes chapter 5, 4-7. It says, "When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it." In other words, be careful what you say. Better not to promise if you're not that confident about it. Careful with the language you use. So clearly, vows and promises are serious verbal commitments. They're designed to build trust and cohesion in a society. Your word can be trusted, and they're designed to discourage deceitfulness. We could also think of an example in our world that's always been the case, marriage vows and promises. I mean, that's probably the most obvious one. A marriage vow is a solemn promise. It's a commitment, as we know, for life. Faithfulness to that person, excluding all others, for better or worse. It is a solemn promise and a vow. We make those vows and promises to our loved one to reassure them that we are going to stick to it and stick with them. Right? That's what a vow is. We still do it. And we still see the sense in it. And we still see, well, it's a really, really good thing to do. And to do all that you can to keep that promise. All that you can. And we also have seen that breaking a vow was often associated with some sort of a curse from a deity. And we also saw that at times vows can be broken or overridden in exceptional circumstances, right? All that was in the head of the people Jesus was speaking to. Okay, so what is the problem? The problem is what was going on at that time was that people were making vows and promises with the deliberate intent not to keep them, with a way out. And that's what Jesus mentions here about do not swear by heaven or because it's God's throne, or for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is a city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. See, these things that he mentions there were examples of people swearing on things or calling on something to witness or to validate their promise with the intention to give themselves a way out. And notice that heaven, earth, Jerusalem, head, none of those things actually mention the name of the Lord. Okay? And that was very deliberate. To mention the name of the Lord in a vow was like the highest thing you could promise on. And to break that vow, well, you're bringing upon yourself to break that promise, God's wrath. So if you just promise on something a bit less than God, then there's not quite the obligation to keep your word. This descending order had been created of importance. It was a sophisticated system to, I suppose, give people, a bit of a break clause. Like in a contract, like a rental contract, there's a break clause. If I break this contract, this is my penalty. And in Matthew chapter 23, we see Jesus addressing this concept of making promises with these lesser requirements to obey. And it's quite interesting how he fleshes this out, right? So listen to this. This is making oaths and the issue of avoiding following your promise. That's what we're talking about here. He says, woe to you, talking to the Pharisees and scribes, woe to you blind guides. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on the altar, he's bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. So here's a bit of an insight into how the practice of making promises and oaths was being abused by the people of Jesus' time, especially the religious leaders. And Jesus demonstrates their flawed logic, actually. He's saying, you've made up these rules that, if you swear by the temple, it's not that big a deal. You can break that promise. Oh, but if you swear by the gold that's in the temple, whoa, you've got to keep that promise. And Jesus is saying, you guys are crazy. It doesn't make even sense that the gold is more important than the temple itself. Gold's just a piece of, a rock, a mineral. But the temple's a place where God lives. So it doesn't even make sense that you'd prefer to make that the gold is more important than the temple. And, the gift is more an important thing to swear on than the altar that it's put on. And it's the altar that makes the gift itself sacred. And you guys have got it completely around the wrong way. You're saying that the gift is more important than the altar itself, and the altar is God's altar. And so, he says here that, and anyone who swears in heaven, you say, if I just swear on heaven, make a promise on heaven, I'm not using the Lord's name, so that's okay. If I break that promise, that's okay. So he says, you're crazy because heaven is the place where God lives anyway. So, your logic of how you're figuring this whole thing out doesn't even stand up. Do you understand that, what he's saying here? Their own logic of their different levels of breaking rules was wrong, and Jesus addressed that. So we're talking here about the Jews and the religious leaders' practice of having an inbuilt break clause, like making a wedding vow and including the little phrase, I promise to be faithful to you as long as love lasts. Ever heard that one? Inserted in a wedding vow. I'll be faithful to you. I'll only be with you for the rest of my life, as long as love lasts. Which can be interpreted as soon as I start loving someone else more than you, I can break that because, love hasn't lasted. Or you're just going through a rough patch and, I don't feel love. Maybe, I just feel a bit angry. So love's gone, so I don't have to... As long as love lasts, I'll be faithful. As soon as I feel that love's not there, I'll break that promise. These are the type of vows and things and promises that people put into weddings these days. Like, not everyone, of course, but that's just a sort of thinking that these religious leaders were having about promises and vows that they were just making to other people and calling upon God, or as calling upon the gold on the temple or whatever. It's like, what kids used to do. They would have their hands behind their back when making a promise at school, right? And they'd cross their fingers. I promise you'll be my best friend. Oh, I made that promise, but I was crossing my fingers so I don't have to keep it. That's the sort of thing that was going on. It's a little bit, I suppose, like the fine print on a contract. Things that aren't pointed out to you, which gives people a way out. And lastly, keeping your word and keeping promises. The heart of what Jesus is saying here is in verse 37. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. The heart of what Jesus is saying is just this. You shouldn't have to make vows. You shouldn't have to reassure people that you're going to tell the truth because your word is so dependable anyway. Your yes, everyone knows your yes means yes, and you're going to fulfill it. Everyone knows that your no means no. You're not a duplicit person who changes their mind all the time and can't be relied upon. Jesus is saying you shouldn't have to do all that stuff, and you certainly shouldn't make, those sort of promises, the sort of things that was going on. And Ephesians 4:25 says, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbour, for you're all members of one body. So, to put it clearly and simply, Jesus wants us just to speak the truth. Of course, there are some groups, Christian groups, that forbid Christians from making, court oaths based on these words of Jesus. They say, no, you shouldn't do it. Jesus forbade it. And it's actually wrong to make a court oath. But I don't really think that's what Jesus is on about here. Because when you think about it, all promises and all words that come out of our mouth, God hears anyway, doesn't he? God is our witness to everything that comes out of our mouth. And when a society, when a court is asking you to, swear on the Bible or make an oath before all they're saying is, no one here really knows you. We just want you, and we want to know that what you're about to say, you've really thought about it, and you're going to tell the truth. Because words can be said so loosely. So a court is simply asking you to tell the truth. That's all it's doing. We want some extra assurance that what you're going to say is true. You know, why if someone asks you to do that, it's not because, you feel you need to. It's because the court's saying it's our standard in society that we want people to be really clear that what they're going to say is the truth. So someone asking you for more assurance simply to say the truth, why is that such a bad thing? I don't think there's anything wrong with, swearing on the Bible. What I'm going to say is true. Jesus' words to us is about not having two standards of truth and not needing to make oaths in normal interaction because our simple word is trustworthy. All our words are witnessed by the Lord anyway. So we should be used to that carefulness that comes with the use of our words. Now, interestingly, how does this play out in the rest of the New Testament? And interestingly, we see the Apostle Paul, from time to time in his letters, making vows or oaths. Okay. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 20, he says, I assure you before God that what I am writing to you is no lie. Okay? So he's calling upon God and he's saying, I assure you before God. God is my witness that what I'm saying to you now about the gospel, it's no lie. I'm not lying about it. Paul felt the need to call upon God to witness his words. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 9, he says, God, whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness, how constantly I remember you in my prayers. So Paul's saying, I pray for you all the time, church. God's my witness. He knows I pray, and I'm saying, I'm calling upon him. He's giving extra assurance that the words he's saying are truthful. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 5, he says, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. Right. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, here is an interesting one that I think deals with, I suppose you could say, both sides. He says, I call God as my witness that it was in order to spare you that I did not return to Corinth. Okay, so what's happening here is Paul had said earlier to the Corinthian church, he had projected ahead his plans, his visitation schedule of how he's going to visit this church, then he's going to visit that church, then he's going to come back to Corinth and he's going to visit them. Right? And so, however, he changed his plan and he didn't come back when he said he was going to come back. And so people were going around saying about Paul, you can't trust what Paul says. He doesn't fulfill his promises. So how can you trust his gospel? Paul said he was going to come and visit you, but he changed his mind. You can't trust anything Paul says. That's what he was addressing here in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And he clearly says to them the reasons why his plan changed and why, in a sense, I'm not sure if it was like a vow, but he definitely said words that I'm going to do this, I'm going to come back and visit you, which some people could say, well, you promised. And he had to change his plans. And he changed his plans for a very, very good reason. And so he explains to them why, on that particular issue, it was better that he didn't come back to them. Because they were doing some bad stuff and he wanted to save them from another harsh rebuke. He'd already done it once. He didn't want to come back and do it again. He thought the timing wasn't right. So he said, no, I won't go there now. I'll do that another time. So he explained why he calls God as his witness, why he had to break his promise. Interesting. These two things. So Paul used oaths and oath language when the thing he is claiming seemed difficult to believe. Okay, when he thought that some people might find this hard, so I will call God as, I'll make a promise before God that what I'm saying is really true. He didn't really see that using that language was a breaking of what Jesus commanded in the Sermon on the Mount about just let your yes be yes. He went further than just my yes or no. He went further than that and called God as his witness. I hope I've made that point. I keep repeating it. In other words, when you see the way Paul understood what Jesus said, he sees the real intent of what Jesus is getting at here about speaking the truth and fulfilling your promises, but he also understands that if you take that too literally, in every case, we'd all be condemned because from time to time we all have to change our plans. So, but it seems okay as long as you've got a good reason. Okay, so you say to your family, let's kids, we're going to go camping and we're going to head to the coast and we're going to, spend so much fun at the beach, surfing and digging and making sandcastles. It's going to be awesome, kids. What a great Christmas we're going to have. Then you lose your job. And you can't afford to go to the beach. And this Christmas, you've got to stay at home. I had plenty of Christmases where we stayed at home, we didn't go anywhere, when I was a kid. So what do you do as a dad or as a mum when you've made a promise, say to your kids, and things have changed? Like, honestly, you just don't have the money, you can't afford it. Oh, I've made a promise, but I can't keep it. You come up with a good reason why, a reason that makes sense, that's the truth, that explains why, in that particular case, you can't fulfill that. I think most people would accept that and go, oh yeah, okay, Dad lost his job. And I think the other final thing here is, it's very interesting the way God himself made an oath. In Hebrews chapter 6, right? Verses 13 to 17. When God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so, after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. Men swear by someone greater than themselves, like I call God as my witness. And the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument. But because God wanted to make the unchangeable nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. Okay? So, the Lord said to Israel, I promise that I'm going to, the covenant, and I swear by myself that I'm going to keep it. There's no one greater than God, so he swears by himself. So here was another occasion where, God himself realised that what he's making here is a solemn promise to the Israelites of covenant faithfulness. I will never leave you, you're going to multiply, you're going to take the land, the whole thing, right? He says, I could just say that and you should believe me. But I'm going to use it as an oath. I'm going to swear by myself. In other words, I'm underlining how important and how serious this promise is. Okay? God himself, interestingly. So what's this really all about? Well, there we go. Didn't have another one. The bigger picture, I think, here is that it's not just normal human interaction with each other that benefits from us keeping our word. It obviously does, and in workplaces and all that, if you keep your word, it enhances truthfulness, truth-telling, cohesion. Everyone's happy when you fulfill a promise, right? So it is about that. God doesn't want deceitful people in his kingdom. If there are, he wants them to repent. So it is about that, but can't you see here the bigger picture really is that our truthfulness of keeping our word, keeping promises, reflects God's truthfulness to us. Like that we are people of God. We are his ambassadors, his representatives. And we want people to trust our words when we share the gospel. That our message can be trusted, our testimony about how we got saved. These are people who are trustworthy speakers. And so when we have a culture, we have a value that we really try hard to fulfill our promises, it enhances and it makes the gospel, it makes God himself look good, it gives glory to him, and it makes his gospel look more trustworthy. I hope that makes sense. That's really the bigger picture here. Our words should be that clear that our yes is yes. But there are times when we feel we need to, even calling on God as your witness, like Paul did it, you're simply saying, what I'm saying here, all my words that I say, I hope and I want to be truthful, and I want God to keep me accountable to that, because he's my Lord. We also need to, I think, consider the role of grace here. Sometimes things are out of our control and there is the need to go back on something we've said. It is a normal part of human life that we just don't know all things in the future. We just don't know. And you often see politicians, they're accused of never keeping their promises, but often what's being asked of them is to know the future. It's honestly, reporters will often ask them about something in 2 years' time. Will you do this? And they struggle. You see them trying to talk about, well, that's what we want to do, but they also bear in mind that things change. And I'm not that hard on politicians when they change their mind, because often there's good reasons for it, to be truthful. So there's a need here to be gracious that humans don't know the future. Only God does. And if someone makes a promise to you, I'm not talking about a marriage vow, that's a different category, but I'm talking about like in everyday language about things, and it doesn't end up that way, and they're not being deceitful, it's just the way things worked out. We just got to be gracious and loving and forgiving, and not take it so much to heart that we get so crippled by it. Never trust you again. I mean, come on. Graciousness is required in this sort of thing. And I think part of what the army says, be flexible, mate. There's a big truth in that, in life. Be flexible, mate. You'll get over it. But having said that, keeping your word is very important, and we should try our hardest to do that. You may have looked at my little finger here and wondered, what's that funny thing around his finger? Right? You know what that is? It's because a little person during this week made me this lovely little ring out of their rubber bands and said, will you wear this? And I promised I would. So the pressure was on, people. Keep your word, Greg. It was a really good reminder of this sermon. Okay? Does it mean much to me? Oh, a bit of embarrassing, but I tell you what, it means a lot to that little person who made that ring to me, that I would fulfill that a big, important person like me would wear something they made. So it's important, isn't it, to keep our word? Let's pray. Lord, your word is truth and we can rely on it 100%. You made promises to us about our salvation, about how you have dealt with our sin and you've reconciled us to God. These are wonderful promises that we completely believe in because we know you cannot lie. There's no circumstance outside your control, God, and you keep your word. Lord, help us to be promise keepers. Help us to be diligent, to do everything we can to keep our word and to be trustworthy people with the use of our promises and language. Lord, we need your grace and your help in doing these things. Amen.